Everybody loves Dana White's Contender Series, and in 2024, the show is not scheduled to start until late August, so we've got a lot of time to keep our eyes out for up-and-coming prospects, and that is something that I have been doing ever since the end of Dana White's Contender Series 2023. So in this video, and in future videos that I will be releasing over the next few weeks or so, I'm going to be talking about every fighter that I am hoping is going to be on the UFC's Dana White's Contender Series in 2024. As you can imagine, I've got one for every single weight class. This one is the flyweights, and last year I noticed in 2023 we actually didn't see that many flyweights on the show, which is interesting because I do think that flyweight is one of those weight classes on the UFC roster that probably could do with a little bit of a bolstering. I mean, I think there's only around 40 fighters or so on the roster, whereas with lightweight there's about 80, for example. And flyweights, everyone loves flyweights. Flyweights always put on great shows, they always put on great fights, and they're usually some of the more technical fights that you see in the UFC. So I'm looking forward to hopefully seeing some flyweights on the show in 2024. I did want to point out one thing as well that I noticed when I looked through my 2023 list to potentially see if I had missed anybody. A lot of people that I talked about last year are in the UFC right now, like Joshua Van, Steve Erceg, who's fighting for the title, Azat Maksum, Asu Almabayev was on there as well, and a bunch of other fighters as well that are in the UFC or were on the Contender Series. We're all on that list. So I'm hoping that we can go back to back and also happen to have a lot of fighters on this list in the UFC, because I do believe that some of the best unsigned prospects in the world are on my list because I'm really researching for these. And another thing I wanted to say is Dana White said at the UFC 300 post-event press conference that he spends most of his free time now scouting new up-and-coming talent and watching regional shows. So how's it going, Dana? I've compiled a bit of a list for you, but anyway, let's get started with the only returning fighter that has been on the Contender Series in the past. It's Mitch Roso, and that is where he had his only professional MMA loss. He did lose an exhibition fight on the Ultimate Fighter, I should say, sorry, in 2021. Soon after that, lost to Jake Hadley, who's happened to become a pretty decent prospect himself. Since then, he's gone on a 4-fight win streak, and now I feel like he's definitely coming into a bit of his prime. He's a decent wrestler, and I think that he could definitely fit into the UFC roster with a 9-1 record. He was scheduled to fight Cleveland McLean, which unfortunately didn't happen because Cleveland McLean is a guy that does test a lot of prospects. I mean, Joshua Van fought Cleveland McLean before getting into the UFC. Mitch Roso, a good wrestler. He's from the USA, and I think at 25 years old on a win streak, I think he's deserving of an opportunity, and the UFC definitely knows who Mitch Roso is because he's been on the Contender Series and the Ultimate Fighter before. The next fighter is Fumi Nkuta. I do apologize if I'm saying his surname incorrectly there, but Fumi is a guy that is a very hot prospect right now. He's a guy who is claiming on Twitter that he cannot find any regional fights anywhere, and he's definitely a guy that I think would fit in pretty well into the UFC, as he does have very good wrestling, and he took a pretty decent amount of time off between 2021 and 2023 to actually pursue a professional wrestling career. But now he's come back to the UFC, defeated Cleveland McLean, who I was just talking about, and then defeated somebody else. Apparently, the UFC does already know about Fumi Nkuta, but apparently they think that he isn't the most exciting fighter in the world, which is kind of true, but at the end of the day, he truly is one of the most talented guys on the regional scene right now. And I do think that he could definitely make a statement and a splash into the UFC's flyweight division. Another fighter that could do that is Lona Keva. Lona Keva, I believe, is half English and half Chinese, if I'm not mistaken in saying that. But he is definitely one of the most exciting young flyweight prospects in the world right now. He just defeated an incredibly talented fighter in Sean Marcos da Silva in a decision that he made look relatively easy. I mean, he has super fast hands, he's a really quick striker, and he's just really good, honestly. I mean, he's ran through every opponent that he's fought. He hasn't fought the best guys until he got into Cage Warriors. 4-0, 6-0 Sean Marcos da Silva, who's a great prospect in his own right, beat him pretty handedly. I do think that Lona Keva is a guy that you will see in the UFC eventually. I think he's called for the Cage Warriors flyweight title shot, so maybe he goes that route, but if he doesn't go that route, hopefully we can see him in the Contender Series at some point, or maybe he goes and wins the Cage Warriors title and then signs to the UFC. I'm very interested to see what Lona Keva can do. 6-0, half Chinese and half English, and the UFC is definitely trying to sign more fighters from China. Apparently they had billions of views on UFC 300 from China, because of course they had Yan Xiaonan taking on Zhang Weili, and they've got the UFC Performance Institute in Shanghai, China as well. So he would be a pretty good signing if he was on the Contender Series. Stuart Nickel is an Australian flyweight that is 8-0 and honestly might be able to just get signed directly to the UFC to make his debut at UFC 305 in Perth. Based on his accolades alone, he's 8-0 with some of the most power at flyweight you'll probably ever see. 4 wins by knockout, 3 in the first round. Took on this guy here who was 5-0 and knocked him out stiff. Absolutely knocked him out stiff earlier this year, and he's definitely a guy that I think you should keep your eye out for, because I do believe he's going to be in the UFC at some point in his career. Very, very talented striker. Can grapple as well, but man, that power is real at this weight class at 125 pounds for Stuart Nickel. The next fighter is Ernesto Ibarra. The UFC, of course, is looking now, especially very recently, into trying to target that Mexican audience so they can get more fans from Mexico. And one way to do that would be to sign more fighters from Mexico. And Ernesto Ibarra is 9-1, 27 years old, and would be a pretty good signing. He's on a 4-fight win streak right now. Most of his wins do come by decision, but he has defeated some pretty decent opponents in his career. He fights for a Combate Global at the moment, which is, I believe, the promotion of one of the co-founders of the promotion, and he's beaten some good opponents. 5-3, 7-4, 9-2 in his career. Definitely a guy that I do think you could see on the Contender Series this year. Now we've got a guy from New Zealand, Aaron Toe, and he is, of course, a guy that does train at Dan Hooker's gym, and I also believe he trains at City Kickboxing as well. But you can see Aaron Toe hanging out with Dan Hooker on his Instagram all the time. They're definitely good mates, I would assume, anyway. But Aaron Toe, he's a guy I've been talking about for a long time. As you guys know, I am from New Zealand, so I do keep a pretty close eye on good guys coming out of New Zealand, and I feel like Aaron Toe is up there with one of the best. An 8-0 record, a very good striker, does have KO power at this weight class as well. He hasn't really been tested against a very difficult opponent yet, but I do think that's probably a mix of a few things, and the main thing is probably in New Zealand, there just really isn't that much competition for him. So yes, it would be fair to say that he hasn't really beaten the best competition in the world, but he has been beating and dominating everyone that he's been getting put in front of, and I do think he is a guy that is ready for the UFC and would be an exciting fighter in the UFC as well. Alan Martinez is 11-0, and I'm actually going to come out and admit I only found out about Alan Martinez a few weeks ago when I was actually writing my article for We Want Picks about what the regional promotions were on, and I just saw that Alan Martinez at the time was 10-0, and I was like, how have I missed this guy? He's now 11-0. I'm assuming he's a wrestler grappler, because he does win a lot of his more recent fights by decision when he has been taking on decent opponents, but he did recently go out there and ground and pounded out a 10-5 opponent. He definitely isn't a guy that has beaten the best competitions in the world, but he's 11-0. He's a guy I literally only found out about a couple of weeks ago, but at 11-0, and from the United States and from California, this guy is definitely going to be on the Contender Series this year. I have little to no doubt about that. And another fighter I'm very confident is going to be on the show is going to be Paris Moran. I feel like Paris Moran actually had his own opportunity to be in the UFC if he got past Joshua Van, but he didn't. In that matchup, he had success with the wrestling against Van in the first round, but he got caught in the second round, and Joshua Van is now fighting against a ranked opponent very soon, and I think Paris Moran has gone on. Obviously, he's gone on a 3-fight winning streak since then. He's beaten some pretty good fighters since then. A 8-2 opponent, a 7-1 opponent. He's a good wrestler. He doesn't have that many finishing wins, but he is a big guy for 125 pounds, and he is a solid fighter. He's from the United States. He's going to be on the Contender Series. Surely he's on the Contender Series. I definitely believe he is deserving of the opportunity, and I do hope that he will be on there. Christian Torres is once again one of those fighters that I actually only found out about recently when I was looking into articles for We Want Picks. and he is 7-0. He's 5'5", and he's only 23 years old, so this could be potentially one of the fighters that does get, I'm not going to say snubbed, but definitely does miss out just due to him having a bit of a lack of experience, and maybe the UFC has their own eyes on this guy and just want to see him fight a couple more times, which is fair because, once again, he hasn't really fought the best guys. Had a decent amateur run, only went 2-1, but he did fight for IMMAF, which is the leading amateur promotion, I guess you could say. They're kind of like the amateur world championships of MMA, and he did lose to a guy called Murad Ibragimov. After that, went professional, has only been professional for about 3 years, but he has had a pretty good run. Obviously is a good grappler. I mean, so many grappling and submission wins, I should say, in the first and the second round. Not over the best competition, but that's kind of what the Contender Series really is for. You put these guys up against each other, you give them maybe their hardest fights in their career, and if they get through, then you know that they are ready for the UFC, and if they don't, maybe you just let them fight a couple more times for a year or two and bring them back. I think Christian Torres is a good fighter, though. He's a good grappler. I have Diego Manzur here. Diego Manzur is another guy that I have had my eye on for a while. He's from Chile, and the UFC had a bantamweight with a 16-1 record from Chile on last year, and I do think they're probably going to want to sign another fighter from that region. I do think that Diego Manzur is good. He is 10-1. He hasn't fought the best guys again, which is a little bit of a common theme, I guess, but you know, a lot of fighters typically don't fight super high levels of competition until they do sign to a major company, and whether that be One Championship, Bellator, PFL, or the UFC. Diego Manzur did fight one really good fighter in Mark Gray, who I believe is a bantamweight now, and he's a good prospect in his own right, but he just lost recently, and I believe the guy that beat Mark Gray is actually on my bantamweights list, so keep an eye out for that. But yeah, he's beaten good guys. He hasn't really beaten the best guys, though. He has fought for Icon FC, which I believe is Jorge Masvidal's MMA promotion. He's beaten... Okay, I lied. I've actually got him confused with someone else. This is actually really embarrassing. He's beaten Pipe Vargas, and Pipe Vargas is a guy that has lost a few fights, but everyone that Pipe Vargas has lost to has gone on to do something. Austin Bash, he's like 12-0 right now. Jose Johnson's in the UFC. Denny Chavez was in the UFC, and he's got a win over Saeed Yokub Kakramonov by KO by flying knee. And I believe Victor Madrigal was on the Contender Series last year. So Pipe Vargas, a guy that people know, people love, and Manzur beat him. That was embarrassing. I got him confused with someone else. Let's move on. Lois Gurul, 7-0, from the USA as well. Fights at Factory X, Muay Thai. What really more is there to say? He had a little bit of an amateur career, went 2-0 there, and now he's undefeated as a professional. He does actually have a fight booked against Alberto Trujillo, but I am expecting him to win this one. But if he does lose to Trujillo, then I guess you could put Trujillo on this list. But I do believe we're going to see Lois Gurul win that matchup. He fought a couple of very good opponents in his last 3 fights. I think he's going to be ready for that UFC test if he can get past his upcoming opponent. But I do think he's going to do it. Let's move on to a Brazilian fighter, Luis Felipe Herculano, who recently fought for the LFA. And I believe he's only fought for the LFA once. Yes, I'm correct in saying that. Made his LFA debut earlier this year and won it in 16 seconds. It's wins like that get you opportunities on the Contender Series, honestly. I feel like there were a few fighters like that last year who just had straight up great wins, and very recently, and were on the Contender Series. I think Luis Felipe is one of those guys. He's young too, 25 years old at 125 pounds. Definitely a guy I think you could see in the UFC. And now as I move on, a lot of these fighters I'm either unsure about, or I think they might be signed elsewhere, because I've got Takeru Uchida here, who the UFC knows exists. He was on the road to UFC last year, and he did beat Sean Etchill, who is a guy that I am a fan of. I was a little bit upset that he beat Sean Etchill. Then he lost to a veteran of the scene, but he's come back with another win. He's 21 years old. He's another one of those guys that's a Japanese grappler. You know, you've got Tatsuro Taira now. Rei Saruya is going to be making his debut against Christian... Oh, I can picture his face. Is his name Christian? Rei Saruya is going to be making his debut on short notice soon anyway. It's Carlos Hernandez, sorry. Rei Saruya is going to be fighting him. Takeru Uchida, got that style. He's small for the weight class, but he's young. He's 21 years old. He could be on the road to UFC though, which is why I'm a little bit unsure, because Kun Zo Kun Zhao could also be on the road to UFC, and we just don't know about it yet because it hasn't been announced. But Kun Zhao recently just beat Tian Haofeng, who was 15-2 at the time. He did lose to Jifa Shang, but trust me, Jifa Shang, every single prospect that there's ever been in China at 125 pounds, Jifa Shang has beaten them. So I don't really take that too much to anything. Like losing to Jifa Shang, it just kind of happens, I guess. He has lost to Kulon, who is another guy that the UFC is very familiar with. He just beat Tian Haofeng. He's a good grappler. He's got submissions. 12-4 from China. The UFC wants more fighters from China. I think it makes sense. Christian Natividad hasn't fought in a long time, but he was on my list last year and hasn't fought since then. He hasn't fought since 2022. I'm not too sure what's going on because he went 5-0 as an amateur, 5-0 as a pro. He might be injured. He might be taking time off. He might be working on something else. I mean, you never know. Fighters are human. He might have a job that he just can't fight while he's doing. You never know. But he hasn't fought since 2022. I'm not 100% sure what he's doing. But he's another guy that I think you could see in the UFC. He's from America, from the USA, from Hawaii. Let's move on to Diaz Arov, who is 15-3 and is from Kazakhstan. The UFC just signed a couple really good flyweights from Kazakhstan. Azat Maksam, I believe, was 16-0 at the time that they signed him. And Asu Almabayev, I think, was 17-2 at the time that they signed him. So you know that the UFC knows that these Kazakhstani flyweights... Kazakhstani, is that what they're called? These flyweights from Kazakhstan do exist. And Diaz Arov is one of them. He's 15-3, and he's beaten good guys, man. And I don't think he's under contract with a big promotion. He beats an 11-0 guy at UAE Warriors, which is one of the best regional shows in the world. 9-2 opponents, 8-1 opponents. And then he beat a 5-3 guy and a 21-7 guy at Niza FC, which is a Kazakhstan-based promotion. I think he might just be UFC ready. I don't know if he needs to go through the Contender Series, but he is on my list anyway. Jose Ochoa, 23 years old. He's from Peru. The UFC has a couple guys from Peru now on their roster. James Lontop is going to be fighting the weekend after I record this video. And they also have the other guy from Peru that's going to be fighting Alessandro Costa, whose name has also slipped my mind. But Jose Ochoa, another guy from Peru. There's a lot of really good guys from Peru, and it looks like he actually trains at Shooter Box, which is something I didn't know until I just got exposed while recording this video. But anyway, he's got a lot of knockout wins. He's a fun striker. He did fight at LFA, and that's where I found out about him. I actually didn't know who he was until he fought on the LFA, and out of nowhere, just pulled out an anaconda choke and got a pretty good submission win at a recent LFA card in Brazil. So Jose Ochoa, 23 years old. Maybe they'll wait on him, but he definitely could be ready for the UFC. Sung Chul Lee is 7-1. He looks very young in this photo, so I actually don't know how old he is. He maybe is a guy that's on the road to UFC tournament, and I had a few of those guys on my list, and then I actually looked through MMA Ecosystem's Instagram, and I was like, oh, they're on the road to UFC tournament. So I had to take them off my list, but Sung Chul Lee hasn't got a road to UFC fight announced, so I'm assuming maybe he's not on there. And if he's not, why not give him a shot at the Contender Series? Another fighter out of South Korea. I don't think the UFC has too many fighters from South Korea anymore now that the Korean Zombie has retired. But Chul Lee is a guy that's just knocking people out silly. I mean, he's got 4 knockouts in the first round, which you do not see much at all in the flyweight division, and his one loss come to Seung Guk Choi, who made it all the way to the finals last year against Hyun Sung Park, who is now in the UFC and is going to be taking on Andre Lima at UFC 302, which is going to be a banger of a fight. I do apologize if that made no sense whatsoever, but the point is, the one loss that Sung Chul Lee has got isn't a bad loss, and he hasn't really beaten anyone that good since then, but he's knocking people out. He's finishing fights in the first round. I mean, he's a fun fighter overall. I think he's cool. Maybe he's a road to UFC kind of guy, which does make sense, but at the end of the day, Contender Series is also an option. Tony Laramie is the younger brother of TJ Laramie, and TJ Laramie is a former UFC fighter that did get released recently, but has actually kind of climbed his way back a little bit. He's on a winning streak, but Tony Laramie's his brother, so Maybe we can get his brother in the UFC or on the Contender Series at least. He's been beating some pretty good guys. Recently beat a 4-0 opponent in Tyus White, who is still fighting and still around. And then he beat this guy that was 5-0 in 33 seconds, called Daniel Nunez. Lost a couple fights at the start of his career on a massive win streak now. Definitely a guy that could be in the promotion. I mean, this is another guy who probably could just get signed up straight to the UFC. But Angar Zakharov is from Uzbekistan. The UFC recently signed a few Uzbekistan fighters. Bogdan Guskov, I believe, is from Uzbekistan. And I think I was going to say, I think it's just Bogdan Guskov from Uzbekistan they signed recently. But there are other fighters from Uzbekistan on the roster. I'm just going to leave it there. Angar Zakharov, 12-0. 21 years old, on fighting for one Friday night fights. That's right, I forgot about that. That's why he's so late on the video here. Fighting for one Friday night fights, which is one championship, so maybe he actually does have a exclusive contract with them. But if he doesn't, sign him to the UFC right now. Angar Bish is another fighter towards the end of the video, because I have a feeling that Angar Bish might be on the road to UFC season. Or he's maybe got something else going on. But if he doesn't, then Contender Series or UFC, it could be. We'll see. He hasn't fought since 2022. He's from India. The UFC wants to get more Indian fighters on the roster. Angar Bish would be a smart decision. Shamu Haya ID Lebiecki is a fighter that doesn't have the best record, but he's beaten a very good fighter in Shuai Yin, who is actually on the road to UFC tournament in 2024. Shuai Yin is coming off a loss to Shimahaya, but is going to be on the road to UFC tournament. So why not give the guy that has actually beaten Shuai Yin an opportunity on the Contender Series? Once again, he's from China. The UFC wants more fighters from China as well. He could be a good signing, and I'm assuming he's young. I think he's quite a young guy. He hasn't fought for too long. I think it could be an opportunity for him. And another one, this is another one of those fighters. Dong Hoon Choi. Sorry, this video's gotten a bit of a mess towards the end. Dong Hoon Choi, I can tell you, is on the road to UFC tournament. He was on my list for the Contender Series, but he is on the road to UFC tournament. Dong Hoon Choi. Expect to see him on the road to UFC tournament. A good fighter, young guy, 25 years old, from South Korea. Let me know what you think of that. I do apologize, it got super sloppy towards the end. But that is my full list of flyweights that I've got my eye on. And mostly fighters that I think should be on the Contender Series in 2024 in the flyweight division. Let me know what you think. And I'll see you guys in the next one, which will probably be my bantamweight that should be on the Contender Series in 2024.